September afternoon, and the dust wouldn't settle in the frontier town square. The courthouse steps had been converted to an auction platform, rough planks nailed over stone, and the woman standing there hadn't been given water since yesterday. Aida kept her chin low because eye contact always earned worse punishment. Her doeskin dress hung torn at the shoulder, exposing bruised brown skin, and her bare feet showed rope burns at the ankles where chains had been. The crowd numbered 40 men, maybe more, all shouting over each other. Savage. Contraband. Worthless as spit. The auctioneer barked numbers like he was selling livestock. $2 for this treaty violator. Do I hear two? Silas Brennan sat front row, leather satchel resting against polished boots that didn't belong in this dust. Survey maps peeked from the bag's opening. He wasn't bidding, just watching, smiling. Caleb Thornton stood at the back, jaw working against something he couldn't name yet. His calloused fingers opened a small cloth pouch, counted 8 silver dollars twice, last money from selling his dead wife's wedding ring. The coins felt heavier than they should. His voice cut through the jeering. $8. The crowd went quiet. Silas turned, recognition spreading across his face like oil on water. His grin widened. Water won't save you, Thornton. Above them all, the courthouse bell hung motionless against the sky. Locals said it hadn't rung since Chief Tahoma died 10 years back. The auctioneer's greasy palm closed around the 8 silver dollars like they might vanish. Metal clinked against metal, the sound too cheerful for what was being bought. He unlocked the rope around Aida's wrists with rough jerks that nearly threw her forward. Red welts circled both wrists, raw and weeping. Caleb stepped towards the platform, but Silas Brennan intercepted him at the edge, close enough that the expensive cologne reached Caleb's nose. Out of place. Wrong. Everything about Brennan was polished and deliberate. Generous of you, Thornton. Silas's voice carried just far enough for the dispersing crowd to hear, spending your last dollars on a federal problem. Caleb said nothing. He'd learned years ago that silence unsettled men like Brennan more than words. Silas leaned closer, dropped his voice to a whisper meant only for Caleb. You just bought a treaty violation. Federal marshals already filed paperwork. 28 days, Thornton. Then I take everything. He patted the leather satchel. Your deed, your water rights, that sad little homestead, all of it. He walked away before Caleb could respond, boots leaving clean prints in the dust while everyone else tracked mud. Aida stood on the platform waiting, not moving toward Caleb, not running, just standing like someone who'd learned that choices weren't hers to make anymore. Up close, Caleb saw how sunken her cheeks were, how her breathing came too shallow. Starvation did that. Took the body piece by piece until only the will remained. Can you ride? His voice came out rougher than intended. She nodded once. He brought his horse from the rail and helped her up. She climbed into the saddle in front of him, movements careful like everything hurt. Probably did. The crowd watched them leave, silent now, judging in that particular way, frontier towns reserved for those who crossed invisible lines. The ride to his homestead took an hour. Aida didn't speak and Caleb didn't push. The land stretched flat and dry in most directions, yellow grass brittle from months without rain. His cabin came into view first, then the barn with its leaning door, then the corral fence missing rails he kept meaning to replace, and the creek bed, bone-dry, cracked earth where water should have run. Aida's body went rigid against him. The horse felt it too, ears flicking back. She slid down before he could stop her, stumbled slightly, then walked straight to the dry creek. Her bare feet left prints in the dust. She knelt at the deepest part where stones still showed the shape of old current, placed both palms flat against the ground. When she spoke, her English came clear and educated, shocking after her silence. This was Running Springs. Caleb dismounted slow, giving his left shoulder time to adjust. Old cavalry wound that never healed right. Creek's been dry 8 months, longer maybe. No. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw past the exhaustion to something fierce underneath. This was Running Springs. My father brought me here when I was small, before the surveyors came, before... She stopped, jaw tight. Before what? She stood, brushing dust from her torn dress. The motion released the smell of unwashed travel, weeks of captivity, but also something else. Sage, like she'd been kept somewhere the wild plants grew. Before they took the water, her eyes tracked from the creek bed to his cabin, to the distant ridge. Your land? 20 years I've worked it. Built everything here with my own hands. She turned back to the dry stones. My father signed a treaty in 1868. Gave Running Springs to the man who would tend it with honor. Her voice went quiet. They told us you were that man. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the creek bed like ghosts of water that used to flow. Caleb's throat went tight. Who told you? My father, Chief Tahoma. She met his eyes. Before Silas Brennan stole our water and made a liar of the treaty, The sun dropped lower, throwing long shadows across the homestead. Inside Caleb's chest, something shifted. The weight he'd been carrying since Sarah died, since the land started failing, since loneliness became the only constant, it changed shape. Still heavy, but different now. This wasn't just about saving his homestead anymore. Aida knew where the water went, and Silas Brennan had just made his first mistake. Doc Harlow arrived the next morning with his medical bag as an excuse, but the worry in his eyes told a different story. He was 50, graying at the temples, and had the careful hands of someone who'd stitched more wounds than he wanted to remember. "Brought supplies," he said, setting the leather bag on Caleb's table. The smell of carbolic and camphor followed him inside. "Heard you made a purchase yesterday." Aida stood near the stove, wearing one of Caleb's old shirts that hung to her knees. She'd washed her face and hands in the basin, but exhaustion still shadowed her eyes. "Doc Harlow," Caleb said. "This is Aida." Doc's voice went soft. "I knew your father. Good man. I'm sorry for what happened." She nodded, but didn't speak. Doc turned to Caleb, pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Bank's moving on your property. Foreclosure notice came through last week. 28 days, then they auctioned the deed." He spread the paper on the table. Official wax seal, red and unbroken. "Water rights clause, you signed 5 years back. They're claiming you violated terms by not maintaining year-round flow." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Creek went dry because someone dammed it upstream." "I know. So does half the territory? But Brennan's got the bank in his pocket, and the paperwork says otherwise." Doc's finger traced a line near the bottom. "This clause here says if the spring fails, the deed reverts to the original landowner. I am the original landowner. Not according to the land office. According to them, Brennan's company bought the water rights in 1873 through federal treaty amendment. You've been a tenant this whole time, just didn't know it." The words hung in the air like smoke. Outside, horses approached. Multiple riders moving with purpose. Caleb grabbed his rifle from beside the door. Through the window, he saw Silas Brennan and Sheriff Wade, plus a third man he didn't recognize. Federal marshal, from the look of him. Badge catching sunlight, gun belt heavier than local issue. "Stay inside," Caleb said to Aida, but she was already moving toward the door. They met on the porch, 4 men on horseback looking down at one man standing his ground. The marshal spoke first, pulling paper from his saddlebag. "Caleb Thornton, you're harboring a federal ward. Apache woman named Aida, daughter of Chief Tahoma, designated under federal custody following the 73 settlement raids." Aida stepped past Caleb before he could stop her. "I am Aida, daughter of Chief Tahoma." The marshal's expression didn't change. Professional, cold. "You're required to report to federal authority at Fort Bowie. Failure to comply. I will tell you what happened to the treaty." Her voice carried across the yard, steady and clear. "My father signed agreement in 1868. He gave Running Springs to the man who would honor the land and the water. He used his mark." She held up her right thumb. "Here, in the old way. The spiral mark that means keeper of the earth." Silas's smile vanished. "After my father died in 1873, surveyors came to our camp. They brought a new paper. They said it was the same treaty, just written again, but my father was already in the ground." Her voice didn't waver. "I watched them dig him up. I watched them force his dead hand onto the paper and make an X where his mark should have been." Caleb felt the air leave his lungs. Silas recovered quick, reaching into his satchel. "Federal marshal, this woman is delusional from trauma. Here." He produced a yellowed document, wax seal intact. "Is the legal treaty of 1873 properly signed and witnessed? Apache water rights transferred to Brennan Land Development Company." He held it up. "See the mark? Standard X signature for tribal chiefs who couldn't write English." The marshal took the paper, examined it. The wax seal was real enough. Different shade of red than the foreclosure notice. Darker. Older. Sheriff Wade shifted in his saddle. "Silas, if there's a question about—" "There's no question." Silas's voice went hard. "The law is clear. She's federal property, under the custody agreements. Thornton's harboring creates obstruction charges. And if she testifies against federal treaty documents," he looked directly at Aida, "that's treason, hanging offense in Tucson." The marshal folded the treaty, tucked it away. "Miss Aida, you're ordered to Fort Bowie for federal processing. Mr. Thornton, you have 24 hours to comply or face obstruction charges." Caleb stepped between them and Aida. His hand didn't move toward his rifle, but the intent was clear enough. "She stays." Silas's smile returned, predatory now. "Then you'll lose everything, the land, your freedom, and her life." He jerked his horse's reins. 28 days, Thornton, clock's ticking." They rode off, dust rising behind them in the still air. Doc Harlow came onto the porch, face pale. "Caleb, if what she's saying is true, if Brennan forged that treaty—" "He did." Aida's voice was quiet, but certain. I was 12 years old. I have never forgotten the sound of shovels hitting my father's grave, or the smell of his body when they pulled him up. She looked at Caleb. The mark on that paper is wrong. My father's thumb made a spiral. That X is a lie written in his name. The sun beat down on dry earth. No water anywhere. No justice either, from the look of things. Caleb made his decision. Then we prove it. And inside the cabin, lamplight pushed shadows into the corners. Aida sat at the table, fingers tracing patterns in the dust that had settled on the wood surface. Doc Harlow poured coffee with hands that shook slightly, and Caleb leaned against the counter, watching her face as she gathered words. My father was a man of peace, she began. After the wars, he wanted only to keep our people safe. The soldiers came in 1868 with papers and promises. They said if we moved to the reservation lands, they would protect the sacred places, the springs, the burial grounds. Her finger moved through the dust, creating a spiral pattern, deliberate, beautiful in its simplicity. An organic curve that started small at the center and opened outward. This was my father's mark, the spiral of water, the spiral of life continuing. He pressed his thumb in ink and made this on the treaty paper. The soldier witness, Thomas Whitfield was his name, he wrote Chief Tahoma beside it. My father gave Running Springs to the man who tends it with honor, not to the government, not to a company, to whoever would honor the water. Caleb stared at the spiral in the dust. Nothing crude about it. Nothing accidental. Doc set down his cup hard enough that coffee sloshed. I remember Whitfield, Indian agent, honest man, rare as that was. He left the territory in '72, said he couldn't stomach what was coming. He knew, Aida said. When my father died in the spring of '73, fever took him. The surveyors came within a week, 3 white men with papers and shovels. Her voice stayed level, but her knuckles went white against the table edge. They said they needed to verify his mark for the land office, said it was procedure. The lamp flame flickered. Outside, evening crickets started their song. I followed them to the burial site. I was 12, old enough to understand wrong when I saw it. She drew a second mark in the dust beside the spiral. This one was just 2 crossed lines, sharp, crude, an X. They dug him up. His body was still. He hadn't been gone long enough to. She stopped, swallowed. They forced his dead hand onto a paper, made this, not the spiral, this. Doc Harlow's breath caught audible in the small space. Then they buried him again, took the paper. 6 months later, Brennan's company owned the water rights. The spring that fed your creek, they dammed it. Sold the water to the mining operations, 40 miles east. Your Running Springs died because they killed it. Caleb's coffee had gone cold in his hand. He set it down carefully, like any sudden movement might shatter something in the room. You've carried this for 15 years. I had no one to tell. Our people were scattered. The Indian agent was gone. And I was a child whose father had just died. She looked up at him. Then I was property, passed from camp to camp, used, forgotten. Until yesterday, when you paid $8 for a treaty violation. The weight of it settled on Caleb's shoulders like the old cavalry pack he used to carry. Heavier than personal loss, heavier than failed land. This was murder dressed in legal papers. Doc cleared his throat. If what you're saying is true, and I believe it is, then every claim Brennan's made is fraud. The water rights, the land transfers, all of it. Proving it's another matter, Caleb said. Apache woman can't testify in territorial court, and you heard the marshal. Federal law says she's their property. Not if we can get Judge McCready to hear the case. Doc looked between them. Circuit judge. Due in town in 10 days. He's territorial authority, not federal. And he's... Doc hesitated. He's dying. Consumption. Has maybe 3 months left. I've been treating him. Why would a dying man take on Silas Brennan? Caleb asked. Because dying men want their last acts to count. Doc stood, gathering his medical bag. The leather creaked, well worn. McCready's been signing papers for 40 years. Some of them righteous. Some of them... He shook his head. Let's just say a man, facing his maker, starts thinking about the ledger. Aida's finger traced the spiral one more time. If I testify, they will hang me. If you don't, Caleb said slowly, your father stays a liar in the records. Brennan keeps the water, and every other claim he's forged stays legal. He moved to the table, placed his own thumb beside her spiral in the dust. His print was different, rough, scarred from work, but honest. This isn't about my homestead anymore. It's about setting one thing right in a territory built on bent law. Doc paused at the door. I'll talk to McCready, but understand, Brennan owns the federal marshal. If she steps foot in that courtroom, they'll arrest her the moment she leaves it. He looked at Aida. You'll be choosing between silence and a rope. The door closed behind him. His footsteps faded. The horse's hooves retreated down the road. Caleb and Aida sat in lamplight, 2 marks in the dust on the table between them. 1 spiral, 1 thumbprint, both honest, both dangerous. 28 days, she said quietly. Will that be enough of time? Caleb looked at the marks, at the difference between the spiral and the X, at what 15 years of carrying truth alone could do to a person. It'll have to be. 10 days crawled by like wounded animals. Caleb taught Aida the language of territorial law. Plaintiff, defendant, testimony, evidence, forgery. Each word a small weapon she might need. She taught him what his land used to be, how water chose its path, how the Apache measured honor by what you protected rather than what you owned. On the morning Judge McCready arrived in town, they rode in together. Caleb noticed how Aida sat straighter in the saddle now, shoulders back instead of hunched in defense. Healing took odd shapes sometimes. The hotel where circuit judges stayed smelled of old tobacco and boiled coffee. The stairs creaked under their boots, 2nd floor, 3rd door. Doc Harlow had arranged the meeting for early, before town gossip could spread. Caleb knocked twice. Enter. The voice inside was rough, dragged across gravel. Judge Elias McCready sat in a chair by the window, morning light showing every year of his 68 on his face. Gaunt didn't cover it. The man looked like he was already negotiating with death, just hadn't signed the final papers yet. A bloody handkerchief rested on the small table beside him, still damp. Mr. Thornton, McCready gestured to the other chairs. And you must be Miss Aida. Doc Harlow's told me about your situation. They sat. The room held the medicinal smell of laudanum and the deeper scent of sickness, the kind that came from lungs giving up piece by piece. Caleb laid it out plain. The 1868 treaty, Chief Tahoma's spiral mark. The exhumation in 1873, the forged X, Brennan's water theft, the foreclosure. All of it in under 5 minutes, because a dying man's time was worth more than most. McCready listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, the judge pulled a handkerchief to his mouth and coughed. Wet, deep, the kind that rattled. When he lowered the cloth, fresh blood spotted the white fabric. Forgive me, he said. Consumption doesn't wait for convenient moments. He folded the handkerchief carefully. Doc says I have perhaps 3 months. Less if the territory's dust keeps finding my lungs. Aida spoke for the first time. Then why would you take this case? Silas Brennan will fight with every resource he owns. McCready's eyes, still sharp despite the failing body, met hers directly. Because I've signed papers for 40 years, Miss Aida. Some righteous, some, he gestured vaguely, some I wish I could unsign. A man facing judgment himself starts thinking about the ledger he's carrying. You'll hear the case? Caleb asked. I will, 7 days from today. Territorial court has jurisdiction over land fraud, even when federal treaties are involved. He coughed again, softer this time. But understand this clearly. If I rule in your favor, Brennan will appeal to federal circuit. That process takes months. I won't live to see it concluded. Meaning? Meaning this is one chance. One ruling. If I find fraud and he appeals, you'll be fighting federal judges who weren't in this room, who didn't hear Miss Aida's testimony, who only see paper trail. McCready's hands trembled slightly as he reached for water. The law is a weapon, Mr. Thornton, usually pointed at people like her. We're trying to turn it around for one afternoon. Aida stood, walked to the window. Her reflection ghosted in the glass. When I testify, the federal marshal will arrest me. Yes, McCready said simply. Federal statute prohibits Apache wards from testifying in treaty matters. They'll call it tribal interference. Penalty is hanging. The room went quiet except for McCready's labored breathing. Then the law wants me silent or dead, Aida said to her reflection. The law, as written by men who profit from your silence? Yes. McCready set down his water glass. But territorial law supersedes federal when fraud is proven on territorial land grants. It's a narrow door. We're trying to walk through it before it closes. Caleb stood. And if we don't try, then Brennan keeps the water, you lose everything, and Chief Tahoma remains a liar in the official record. McCready pulled himself to standing with effort. 7 days, courthouse, noon. He looked at Aida. Young woman, your testimony will be the cornerstone. But you need to choose this clearly, knowing what it cost. They left him there by the window, coughing into fresh handkerchiefs, a dying man trying to balance accounts before the final audit. The street outside was bright, too cheerful for the weight they carried. Caleb started towards the horses, but Silas Brennan's voice stopped him cold. Thornton, a word. Silas stood beside the land office, and next to him was the federal marshal from before. Up close, the man looked harder. 40-something, cold eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. His badge read U.S. Marshal Cutler. They blocked the boardwalk. Caleb positioned himself slightly in front of Aida, Silas smiled his predator's smile. Heard you met with Judge McCready. Wasting a dying man's time seems cruel even for you. We're done talking, Brennan. Not quite. Silas nodded to Marshal Cutler, who pulled a document from inside his coat. Official paper, federal seal. Cutler's voice was flat, bureaucratic. Federal Statute 18-471. Testimony by designated Apache ward in matters concerning treaty lands constitutes tribal interference with federal authority. Penalty upon conviction. He paused for effect. Death by hanging. The words landed like stones in still water. I've filed the statute with the territorial court, Cutler continued. The moment Miss Aida takes the witness stand, she violates federal law. The moment she steps outside that courtroom, I execute the arrest warrant. He folded the paper. No bail for federal treaty violations. Silas stepped closer, voice dropping. It's simple, Thornton. Drop the case. I'll forgive the foreclosure. You keep your sad little homestead. She keeps her life. Everyone walks away. Caleb's jaw worked against the anger rising in his chest. But if you fight this, Silas's smile vanished. You lose her and the land. Federal appeal will tie up McCready's ruling for years. By then you'll be broke, she'll be hanged in Tucson, and I'll own Running Springs anyway. He leaned in. Your choice. Surrender or sacrifice. Caleb started to speak, but Aida's voice cut through first. I will testify. Silas laughed, genuine surprise in it. Then you'll hang, girl, by federal law. My father's honor is worth more than my life. Her voice didn't waver, didn't break. I watched them desecrate his body to write lies. I have carried that silence for 15 years. I will not carry it to my own grave. Marshal Cutler's expression didn't change. Professional, cold. Your funeral, miss. Silas shook his head, almost disappointed. You're both fools. But at least you're fools who understand the price. He turned to walk away, stopped. 7 days, Thornton. Then federal law reminds you why it always wins. They watched him leave, his expensive boots clicking on the boardwalk. Cutler followed, hand resting casual on his gun belt like he'd already executed the arrest in his mind. Caleb turned to Aida. You understand what you just chose? She looked at him directly. No fear in her eyes, just something harder, older. The kind of certainty that came from losing everything already and finding there was still one thing left to protect. Yes, she said. My father's honor, and yours, if you'll still fight beside me. The sun beat down on them. Town noise continued around them, wagons, voices, horses. Normal life, while they stood on the edge of losing everything. Caleb held out his hand, not to lead her, not to protect her, just to stand equal. She took it. Then we fight, he said, together. Back at the cabin. The afternoon light slanted through the single window and caught dust motes floating lazy in the air. Caleb pulled out a slate he'd used years ago for tallying livestock, found a piece of chalk worn down to a nub. He wrote in careful block letters, Plaintiff. The person bringing the complaint to court, he explained. That's us. Aida stood beside the table, watching his hand form letters. She smelled of sage, still. She'd found a patch growing wild near the creek bed and had rubbed the leaves between her palms that morning. The scent clung to her like armor. Plaintiff, she repeated, breaking the word into pieces. Her tongue shaped English carefully, precisely. Missionary school had taught her once, before everything burned. The language was coming back, muscle memory of a life stolen. He wrote defendant. Brennan, the one accused. Oh, defendant. She touched the slate, fingers tracing the letters. The liar who hides behind law. That's about right. Caleb wrote forgery. What he did to your father's mark. She went quiet at that word. Her fingers stopped moving. We don't have to. No. She straightened. I need to know the words they will use. So when they try to twist truth into lies, I can speak clearly. Her eyes met his. Forgery, the word for desecrating the dead to steal water. He wrote testimony, evidence, witness. Each word a small weapon she might need when facing Silas Brennan across a courtroom. The chalk scratched against slate, the sound filling the cabin like whispered preparation. After an hour, she set down the slate. Now you learn. Learn what? Why the water left. She moved to the door, gestured for him to follow. Outside, the late afternoon heat pressed down. They walked to the dry creek bed, where stones still held the memory of current. Aida knelt, placed both palms flat against the cracked earth. Water is not owned, she said. It is honored. My people knew this. The treaty my father signed. It gave Running Springs to the man who would tend it with honor, not possession. She looked up at him. Do you know the difference? Caleb crouched beside her, his knees protesting the movement. Old age and old wounds making themselves known. Reckon I'm learning. Your divining rod, she said. Where is it? He hadn't touched the thing in months. Last time he'd tried, it had stayed dead in his hands, pointing at nothing, finding nothing, like the land itself had given up on him. But he fetched it from the barn anyway, forked willow branch, worn smooth from years of handling. Aida stood in the center of the dry creek bed. "Show me how." He held the rod the way his father had taught him 30 years back. Loose grip, let the wood find its own pull. He walked the length of the creek bed, waiting for the familiar tug downward that meant water below. Nothing. The rod stayed horizontal, dead wood in living hands. "It's been this way since the creek dried up," he said. "Spring's somewhere, but damned if I can find it." "May I?" He handed her the rod. She held it differently, both hands together at the fork's base, eyes closed. She walked slowly, lips moving in words he couldn't hear. Apache prayer, maybe. Or just asking questions the land might answer if someone listened right. The rod stayed still. She opened her eyes, looked at the willow branch in her hands. "The water is here. I can feel it deep below, but it hides." "From me?" "From loneliness." She held the rod out to him. "Hold with me." He stepped close, placed his hands over hers on the wood. The warmth of her skin against his calloused palms was the first human touch he'd allowed in 2 years. His shoulder wound ached where their arms pressed together, but he didn't pull away. "Close your eyes," she said quietly. "Feel the earth, not the wood." They stood together in the dry creek bed, 4 hands on forked willow, evening light turning everything gold. Caleb felt his own heartbeat, felt Aida's breathing beside him, felt the weight of failed crops and lost water, and 28 days counting down. The rod trembled. Just once. Slight enough he might have imagined it. Aida's eyes opened. "Did you feel that?" "Maybe." "The water is here, waiting." She looked at their joined hands on the wood. "But it needs—" She paused, searching for words. "Water flows between things, not to one place or one person. Between—" He understood what she wasn't saying directly. The rod would work when they weren't alone anymore. When 2 people honored the land together instead of one fighting to survive it. "When this is over," she said, "when we have proved my father's truth, we will find it together." They stood there a moment longer, hands still touching, before she stepped back. The evening air felt colder without her closeness. Caleb cleared his throat. "There's somewhere I need to take you, before the trial." They walked to the small rise north of the cabin where a wooden cross stood stark against the sky. No stone. He'd been too poor and too broken to afford one. Just carved wood with Sarah Thornton, 1848, 1876, and their initials beneath. Aida stopped at a respectful distance, but Caleb gestured her forward. He knelt by the grave, hat in hands. The grass here grew sparse and yellow, no flowers, nothing living except guilt. "Sarah," his voice came rough. He hadn't spoken to the grave in months. "I'm using your ring money to save the land you loved, the land we built together." He swallowed. "And I'm using it to save someone who deserves better than this world gave her." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of dry sage across the hillside. "I know you'd want me to fight for what's right, even if it costs everything we worked for." His throat tightened. "And I think—" He stopped, started again. "I think you'd understand why I can't walk away from this. From her." Aida stepped forward, knelt beside him. She held wildflowers in her hand, yellow prairie blooms she must have picked on the walk up. She placed them gently at the base of the cross. "She must have been brave," Aida said softly, "to love a man who risks everything for strangers." Caleb looked at the flowers. First living color this grave had seen in 2 years. She was brave about most things, just not fever. The old anger at helplessness rose in his chest and faded just as quick. "Would have liked you. Would have told me I was a damn fool for what I'm doing. Then would have stood beside me anyway." Then I honor her memory," Aida said, "by standing beside you." They stayed a moment longer, 3 people at a grave, 2 living, 1 gone, all connected by choices made and prices paid. Walking back to the cabin, their hands didn't touch. But they walked close, the space between them smaller than before. And when Caleb glanced at Aida's profile in the fading light, something in his chest that had been frozen since Sarah died cracked just slightly, not melted, not healed, just cracked enough to let feeling back in. Tomorrow they would prepare for the fight. Tonight, they had given themselves permission to try. The cabin waited below, lamplight in the window making it look almost like home again. 4 days until trial. Caleb needed supplies: flour, salt, coffee if the mercantile still had credit for him. He rode into town alone, leaving Aida at the cabin where she'd be safer from stares and worse. The morning was already hot, dust hanging in the air like it had nowhere else to be. He tied his horse outside the general store, and the street went quiet in that particular way. Frontier towns had when gossip arrived before the person it was about. The mercantile door stuck, wood swollen from humidity that came from somewhere else since there wasn't moisture left in this territory. The smell hit him first, Pickles and brine, leather, tobacco, and the sharp tang of judgment. 3 men at the counter stopped talking. The merchant, Wilson, looked up from his ledger and his face went carefully neutral. Thornton. Need supplies? Flour? Salt? Coffee if you've got it? Wilson's eyes flicked to the other men, then back. Cash or credit? Credit. I'm good for it. That's so? One of the men turned. Caleb recognized him. Henderson ran a competing ranch north of town. Heard Brennan's got foreclosure papers on your place. Heard you're harboring a federal fugitive. That true? Caleb kept his voice level. Heard a lot of things aren't true in this territory. And federal marshal posted a warrant. Henderson spat tobacco juice into the spittoon, the ping of it loud in the quiet store. $50 reward for information leading to capture. That's a lot of money for turning in a squaw who's breaking the law. Caleb's hand tightened on the counter edge. Wilson cleared his throat. Look, Thornton, I've got a business to run. Brennan made it clear, anyone extending credit to you is making an enemy of the bank, and I've got loans coming due. So that's how it is. That's how it has to be. Wilson at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. I'm sorry, but I've got a family to feed. Caleb turned to leave, but the door opened before he reached it. Old Murphy stepped through, 70 if he was a day, homesteader from the early days, hands gnarled from decades of hard labor. He looked at Caleb, then at the men by the counter. The hell is this? Murphy's voice carried the weight of someone who'd outlived caring about consequences. Thornton's been a customer here for 20 years, paid every debt, and now you're turning him away because some land-grabbing son of a bitch says jump? Henderson straightened. Federal law is what powerful men write when they want something poor men have. Murphy stepped up beside Caleb. I was here in '68 when Chief Tahoma signed that first treaty. Good man. Honest. And I've watched Silas Brennan steal half this territory through, paperwork and threats. He looked at Wilson. Put Thornton's supplies on my account. I'll vouch for him. Wilson hesitated. Do it, Murphy said, unless you're more afraid of Brennan than you are of looking at yourself in the mirror tomorrow. The merchant's hands moved slowly, gathering flour, salt, wrapped coffee. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Henderson and the other men watched, but didn't move to stop it. The line in the sand had been drawn. They just weren't sure which side would win yet. Outside, Murphy walked Caleb to his horse. Don't thank me. Just don't lose. He lowered his voice. Half the homesteaders in this valley are getting squeezed by Brennan's water schemes. You prove fraud on Running Springs. Proves it on all his other claims, too. Appreciate the faith. Not sure it's justified. That Apache woman, she's telling truth about the treaty? She is. And Murphy nodded slowly. Then you've got more than faith. You've got something Brennan can't buy. He gripped Caleb's shoulder briefly. Justice, if you can keep it alive long enough. Caleb rode toward the courthouse before heading home. He needed to see something, confirm the weight of what they were fighting. The wanted poster was there, nailed beside the courthouse door. Cheap paper, mass-produced, ink already fading in the sun. Wanted by federal authority, Ayita, daughter of Chief Tahoma Apache. Ward, unlawful flight, $50 reward for information. He stared at it, her name reduced to bounty price, her identity erased down to Apache Ward, like she was livestock that had wandered off, $50. More than most men made in 2 months, enough to make neighbors into informants. He tore the poster down. The tack left a hole in the wood. Across the street, Sheriff Wade stood in the doorway of his office, watching. He didn't move to stop Caleb. Didn't intervene, just watched with eyes that said, I see you breaking the law, but I'm not sure which law matters more. Small victory. But the trial was still 3 days away, and every hour that passed was another chance for someone to claim that $50. Caleb rode hard for home. Doc Harlow's horse was already tied outside the cabin when Caleb arrived. The physician stood on the porch, medical bag in hand, but the look on his face said this wasn't a social call. Inside, Aida was pouring coffee. She'd grown comfortable in the space, moving through it like someone who'd decided temporary might become home if they survived the week. Doc, Caleb set the supplies on the counter. Something wrong? Opposite. Harlow set his bag on the table, but instead of opening it for medical instruments, he pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth, old, carefully preserved. The cloth crinkled as he unwrapped it, protective layer after protective layer. Finally, he revealed a document. Yellowed paper, official weight, folded once down the middle. Even from across the room, Caleb could see the wax seal, red, intact, stamped with territorial authority. What is that? Ayita stepped closer, her breath catching. Doc's hands trembled slightly as he spread the paper flat on the table. The original 1868 treaty between the United States and Chief Tahoma of the Apache, the real one, and Caleb moved to the table. The document was handwritten in careful script, Legal language he could barely parse, but at the bottom, clear as day, was a brown ink mark. Not an X, a spiral. Thumbprint pressed into the paper with deliberate care, the whorls and curves visible even after 15 years. Beside it, in different ink, Chief Tahoma, and below that, witnessed by Thomas Whitfield, U.S., Indian agent, September 12, 1868. Aida's hand moved toward the paper, stopped an inch above it. Her fingers trembled. My father's mark. Where did you get this? Caleb's voice came out rougher than intended. Doc pulled out a chair, sat heavily. I've had it since 1873. Whitfield gave it to me before he left the territory. Said he didn't trust what was coming, wanted someone local to keep the original safe. He looked at Aida. When your father died and those surveyors showed up, I knew something was wrong. Whitfield had told me about the spiral mark, said it was Tahoma's signature, meant something sacred in Apache custom. Keeper of the earth, Aida whispered. When Brennan produced that 1873 amendment with the X mark, I pulled out the original, compared them. The spiral on this document, he touched the treaty gently, and the X on Brennan's forgery. 2 different marks, 2 different meanings. Caleb's mind raced. You've had evidence of fraud for 15 years? Doc's face aged another decade in the lamplight. I was terrified. Brennan had federal backing. Marshall was in his pocket even then. Whitfield fled because he knew challenging federal treaty documents meant disappearing into a shallow grave. He looked at his hands. I'm not proud. I kept it hidden, told myself I was waiting for the right moment. Truth is, I was just a coward. Why now? Aida asked. Because Judge McCready is dying. Because you're willing to testify despite the hanging threat. Because... His voice cracked. Because keeping silent another day means I'm as guilty as Brennan for what happened to your father. The room went quiet, except for evening wind rattling the window frame. Caleb stared at the treaty. At Chief Tahoma's thumb spiral, organic and intentional. At the witness signature, from a man who'd cared enough to preserve truth even when fleeing for his life. This is the weapon, he said quietly. This proves forgery. It proves your father's mark was a spiral, yes. Doc looked at Aida. But it doesn't prove what happened in 1873. Brennan will claim the X mark was a second signature, that tribal chiefs often signed multiple times, that his document is legitimate. Aida's jaw set. Then I still have to testify. I have to tell them what I saw. That they dug him up, that they forced the X, and when you do, Doc said gently, Marshall Cutler will arrest you the moment you leave that courtroom. This treaty proves Brennan's document is suspicious. Your testimony is what proves it's murder. The weight of it settled on all 3 of them. Evidence wasn't enough. Truth needed a voice, and that voice would hang for speaking. Caleb reached across the table, placed his hand over Aida's. Then we use both. The treaty shows what the real mark was. Your testimony shows how the false one was made. He looked at Doc. Together, they prove fraud. Together, Doc agreed, they might actually work. Aida stared at her father's spiral mark, preserved for 15 years by a frightened man who'd finally found courage. She traced the air above it, not quite touching, like the ink might dissolve if handled wrong. 3 days, she said quietly. 3 days and I speak for my father, whatever comes after. Outside, the sun dropped below the horizon. The cabin filled with shadow, except for the lamplight on one old treaty document that said, water belonged to whoever honored it. And 3 people who decided honor was worth dying for. The night before trial, sleep wouldn't come. Caleb lay on his bedroll by the stove, listening to Aida pace the cabin floor. Her bare feet made soft whispers against the wood planks, back and forth, like a caged animal testing the walls. He sat up finally. You should rest. She stopped pacing. In the darkness, her silhouette stood framed by the window where moonlight struggled through. If I testify tomorrow and lose, they hang me in Tucson. If I run tonight, they chase me across the territory, but maybe I live. Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted together. If I stay and lose, you lose everything. The land, the water, 20 years of your life. Caleb stood, his knees protesting, moved closer but not too close. Then we lose together. But Aida, he made sure she was looking at him. You're free to go. I won't stop you, won't blame you, won't chase you. You would let me run? I'd let you choose. There's a difference. She turned back to the window. Outside, the world was silver in shadow, quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat, loud enough to drown in your own thoughts. My father chose honor over safety, she said quietly. He signed that treaty believing white men would keep their word. They killed him for trusting. Her breath fogged the glass. If I run, his death meant nothing. The spiral mark stays buried under lies. Brennan keeps stealing water in my father's name. And if you testify? Then maybe, for one afternoon, truth matters more than power. She touched the window, finger tracing patterns in the condensation. Spirals. Always spirals. But truth doesn't stop ropes, does it? Caleb had no answer that wouldn't be a lie. She moved suddenly, decisive. Went to where Caleb's dead wife's shawl hung on a peg by the door. Soft wool, gray, still holding the faint scent of lavender Sarah had loved. Aida had worn it twice. Both times like it was borrowed honor she had to return. She took it down carefully, folded it with precise corners, too neat, the kind of folding that meant something. She placed it on the bed, smoothed it once. Then she gathered a small bundle. The doeskin dress she'd arrived in, now mended, a water skin, nothing else. She tied it with rope, the knot practiced and quick. Aida, don't follow me. She looked at him one long moment. Her eyes held something he couldn't name. Gratitude, regret, determination, fear. Fear, all mixed together like water and earth. You gave me a choice. I'm making it. She walked to the door. Her hand on the latch, she paused. Thank you, she said, for seeing me as more than what they made me. The door opened. Night air rushed in, carrying the smell of sage and dust in the vast emptiness of Arizona territory at midnight. She stepped through. Caleb stood frozen, listening to her footsteps fade into darkness. Every instinct screamed to follow, to protect, to stop her. But he'd meant what he said, her choice, her freedom. He sat by the cold stove, head in his hands, and waited for dawn, like a man waiting for judgment he knew he deserved. Morning came gray and indifferent. Caleb woke with his neck cramped from sitting upright in the chair all night, half hoping to hear her return. The cabin felt emptier than it had in the 2 years since Sarah died. The folded shawl lay on the bed, perfect corners, too deliberate for someone fleeing in panic. He picked it up, held it, tried to understand what it meant. A goodbye? A thank you? An apology for choosing survival? He folded it again, slower, and put it back on the peg where it belonged. Doc Harlow's knock came at dawn. It's time. Caleb opened the door. Doc took one look at his face and knew. She's gone? Left last night. Caleb gestured to the bed where the shawl had been. Can't blame her. Hanging's a hell of a choice to make. Doc stepped inside, looked around like he might find evidence Caleb missed. His medical bag smelled of carbolic, as always, sharp and clean in a world that felt anything but. The trial's in 4 hours. Without her testimony, I'll testify. Say I witnessed the forgery. You weren't there. Brennan will destroy that in minutes. Doc set his bag down heavily. The treaty document shows the spiral mark exists, but without someone who saw the X being forged, it's just 2 different signatures. Brennan claims both are legitimate. We can't prove otherwise. Caleb poured cold coffee from yesterday, drank it like medicine. Then I fight with what I have, which is nothing, which is more than I had a month ago. Caleb grabbed his coat, the one he wore to important things. Funerals, wedding, now this. She chose life over testimony. That's her right. Don't mean I stop fighting. Doc watched him button the coat with fumbling fingers. You understand. If we can't prove forgery, Brennan wins. The foreclosure stands. Federal claim holds. Everything you've worked for. I know. And it'll mean Chief Tahoma dies a liar in the records. I know that too. Caleb settled his hat. But showing up to court with the original treaty is better than letting Brennan's version be the only truth anyone remembers. Maybe that's enough. Doc didn't argue. Sometimes showing up was the only victory left. They saddled horses as the sun broke over the ridge. The ride to town felt longer than it should, each hoofbeat counting down to a trial they'd already lost. The treaty document rode in Doc's saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth, the only evidence they had left. Caleb kept his eyes on the road ahead, didn't let himself look back at the cabin or the dry creek bed or any of it. Looking back made you weak when you needed to be strong, but his chest felt hollowed out. Not from losing the land, he'd been poor before, could be poor again. From losing the possibility, the brief moment when he'd thought maybe loneliness wasn't permanent. Maybe 2 broken people could build something new from the wreckage. She'd chosen survival. He couldn't hate her for that. The courthouse appeared ahead, bells still motionless against the morning sky. A few townspeople gathered on the steps already, drawn by gossip and the promise of spectacle. Justice is entertainment. Doc spoke quiet beside him. What do we do when McCready asks for the witness? Caleb's jaw set. We tell the truth. She was afraid. She ran. And we don't blame her one damn bit. They tied horses at the rail. The courthouse door stood open, waiting to swallow whatever hope they'd carried this far. Caleb touched the wooden rail once, steadying himself. Then he walked toward the door, toward a trial he couldn't win, toward the end of everything he'd tried to save. Behind them, the road stayed empty. No rider appearing at the last minute, no miracle. Just a man walking into a courtroom alone, carrying the weight of a dead chief's honor and his own dying hope. The courtroom was already filling when Caleb and Doc entered. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of 60-plus bodies. Homesteaders, merchants, ranch hands, anyone drawn by the promise of watching Silas Brennan either win or finally face consequences. The air smelled of tobacco and sweat in anticipation. Silas sat at the prosecutor's table, confident, shuffling papers like this was already settled. Marshal Cutler stood behind him, hand resting casual on his gun belt. They looked like men who'd won before walking through the door. Caleb took his seat at the defense table, empty chair, beside him where Aida should have been. Doc set his medical bag down, pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped treaty, placed it carefully on the table between them. Their only weapon, and it wasn't enough. Judge McCready entered through the side door, moving slow, each step deliberate, like his body was rationing energy. His face had grayed since their meeting 4 days ago. Death was patient, but it was also punctual. He settled into the high-backed chair, coughed once into his handkerchief, and surveyed the packed courtroom. The gavel came down, sharp crack that silenced conversations. Territorial Court is now in session. Case of Thornton versus Brennan Land Development, matter of fraud, in treaty documents, and water rights. McCready's voice carried, despite the weakness in his body. Mr. Thornton, you bring the complaint. Present your case. Caleb stood. His shoulder ached from stress and old wounds. Your Honor, we have evidence that the 1873 treaty amendment used to claim Running Springs water rights was forged. The defendant, Silas Brennan, used a fraudulent document to... The courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. Aida stood in the doorway, morning light behind her making her a silhouette. But as she stepped forward, details emerged. She wore a clean dress, simple blue cotton. Someone in town must have helped her. Her hair was braided with careful precision, and in her hands she carried a leather pouch, worn and sacred-looking. Caleb's breath stopped somewhere in his chest. She walked down the center aisle, every eye on her, whispers rising like wind through grass. Federal wanted poster woman, Apache ward, the one who should have run. But her steps were measured, deliberate, like a woman who'd made peace with whatever came next. She reached the defense table, looked at Caleb. I didn't run. I was praying at my father's grave. Her voice was quiet, but clear. He told me to speak. Relief and terror warred in Caleb's chest. He could only nod. Judge McCready leaned forward. Miss Aida, you're the primary witness in this case? Yes, Your Honor. And she stood straight, no apology in her posture. Silas was already on his feet. Objection. Federal Statute 18-471 prohibits Apache wards from testifying in treaty matters. This is illegal testimony. McCready's eyes went cold. Mr. Brennan, this is Territorial Court addressing territorial land fraud. I'll hear her testimony, then I'll rule on jurisdiction. The gavel came down again. Miss Aida, take the stand. Marshal Cutler leaned forward, whispered urgently to Silas. Whatever he said made Silas's confidence crack slightly. Aida walked to the witness stand, placed the medicine pouch carefully on the rail in front of her. The leather was old, decorated with beadwork that had faded but still held patterns. Sacred object, clearly. McCready spoke gently. Tell the court what you witnessed. Aida took one breath, then another. Then she began. My name is Aida, daughter of Chief Tahoma of the Apache. In September 1868, my father signed a treaty with the United States, giving Running Springs to the man who would tend the water with honor. Her voice was steady, strong. He made his mark, not an X, but a spiral. The spiral of water, the spiral of life, continuing. I was 7 years old. I watched him press his thumb into ink and make that mark on the paper. Doc stood, unwrapped the oilcloth, pulled out the original treaty. He brought it to Judge McCready, who accepted it with careful hands. This is the original 1868 treaty, Doc said. Note the thumb spiral at the bottom. Chief Tahoma's true mark. McCready studied it under the lamplight someone had brought forward. The courtroom leaned in collectively. Even from the benches, people could see it. The organic curves, the intentional spiral pressed in brown ink. In the spring of 1873, Aida continued, my father died of fever. Within 1 week, 3 white surveyors came to our camp. They said they needed to verify his mark for the land office. They brought shovels. The courtroom went silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle. I followed them to the burial site. I was 12. They dug up my father's body. It had been 6 days. Her voice caught once, steadied. He was not yet gone to dust. They forced his dead hand onto a new paper. They made an X, not the spiral. An X. Someone in this gallery gasped. They buried him again. They took the paper. 6 months later, Mr. Brennan's company claimed ownership of Running Springs water rights, using that X as my father's signature. Silas shot to his feet. This is fabrication. Traumatized child's false memory. The 1873 document is legitimate, properly witnessed and sealed. He pulled the yellowed paper from his satchel. Here, legal proof. X mark, properly executed. McCready gestured for the document. Silas brought it forward. The judge laid both treaties side by side on his bench, the 1868 original with its spiral, the 1873 amendment with its X. He pulled a magnifying lens from his desk, studied both marks under lamplight. The silence stretched, taut, breakable. Aita opened the medicine pouch, pulled out a small clay disc. This is my father's seal, made when I was 5. He pressed his thumb into wet clay so I would always remember his mark. She held it up. The spiral. Always the spiral. McCready took the clay seal, held it beside the 1868 treaty. Perfect match. The whorls and curves aligned exactly. Then he looked at the X on the 1873 document. Crude, forced. Nothing like the careful spiral. The judge set down the magnifying lens. His hands trembled. I must make a confession to this court. McCready's voice was rough. In 1873, I was a young territorial clerk, 23 years old, ambitious, trusting of authority, and he touched the 1873 document. I signed this amendment, witnessed it, applied the seal. I didn't question the X mark because the surveyors told me it was standard for tribal chiefs who couldn't write English. The courtroom erupted in whispers. McCready raised his hand for silence. I have carried that signature for 15 years. I didn't know. His voice broke. I didn't know they'd desecrated a grave to forge it, but ignorance doesn't erase complicity. He looked at Aida. Your father deserved justice. This court failed him. I failed him. On it he stood, the effort visible. The mark on the 1873 document is a forgery. Miss Aida's testimony, combined with the original treaty and her father's seal, proves beyond doubt that Silas Brennan's water rights claim is fraudulent. He turned to Silas. You are hereby under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit treaty violations. Silas started. Sheriff Wade. McCready's voice cut like a blade. Take Mr. Brennan into custody. The sheriff, who'd been standing at the back, moved forward. He pulled handcuffs from his belt, approached Silas with something like satisfaction. Marshal Cutler stepped forward. Judge, federal authority. Federal marshal, your authority ends where territorial fraud begins. Leave my courtroom. McCready's eyes were steel. And if I find you were complicit in this forgery, I'll see you in shackles beside him. Cutler's jaw worked, but he stepped back. Federal power met territorial justice and blinked first. The handcuffs clicked around Silas's wrist. The sound echoed through the courtroom, final as a grave closing. Then someone, later no one could say who, ran to the courthouse bell rope. The bell rang. First time in 10 years. The sound rolled across the valley, deep and resonant, speaking justice in a language everyone understood. Once, twice, 3 times. It echoed off the ridge, came back doubled, like the land itself was agreeing. People in the courtroom stood. Some cheered, some wept. Homesteaders, who'd been squeezed by Brennan's schemes, grabbed each other's shoulders. Aida stood at the witness stand, tears streaming down her face, hands pressed to her chest like she was holding her heart inside. Caleb crossed the courtroom in 3 strides, stood beside her. Not touching yet. Just there. McCready gavelled for order. The bell still rang outside, but inside he had more to say. Mr. Thornton, your homestead deed is valid. The water rights clause that Brennan used for foreclosure is void, based as it was on fraudulent treaty claims. Running Springs belongs to you, free and clear. He turned to Aita. Miss Aita, you are free. No federal jurisdiction applies. You are a citizen who witnessed a crime and told the truth. The court thanks you for your courage. The gavel came down one final time. This court is adjourned. The bell kept ringing. Justice, announced to a territory that had forgotten what it sounded like. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was too bright for the weight of what had just happened. The bell's echo still hung in the air, fading but not forgotten. Townspeople spilled onto the steps, voices rising in celebration or shock depending on which side of Brennan's schemes they'd fallen. Old Murphy grabbed Caleb's hand, shook it hard. You did it, by God. You proved the bastard was a fraud. Others approached, homesteaders mostly, men whose land claims Brennan had threatened, whose water access had mysteriously dried up when they wouldn't sell. They didn't all shake Caleb's hand, but they nodded, acknowledgement that maybe justice could still exist if you fought hard enough. Aida stood on the courthouse steps, separate from the crowd, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be part of the celebration. Women whispered, looking at her, some with sympathy now, others with the same suspicion they'd always carried. Doc Harlow emerged with Judge McCready leaning on his arm. The judge looked grayer than he had an hour ago, like passing judgment had cost him the last of his strength. He paused when he saw Aita. Miss Aita. His voice was barely above a whisper. Thank you for letting me make one thing right before... He coughed, the sound wet and final. Before the ledger closes. You honored my father today, she said quietly. That is enough. McCready nodded once, then let Doc lead him away toward the hotel, where a bed and laudanum waited. Sheriff Wade brought Silas out in handcuffs. The land speculator's face was twisted with rage, his expensive suit dusty now, all polish gone. Federal appeal will overturn this, you'll see. Circuit judges won't. Keep walking. Wade's hand was firm on Silas's elbow, guiding him toward the jail wagon. Iron bars, small windows. The kind of cage usually reserved for drunks and drifters, not men who'd owned half the territory through paperwork. Marshal Cutler watched from across the street, expression unreadable. He mounted his horse slowly, rode out of town without a word. Federal authority, retreating in the face of territorial truth. Caleb turned to Aida. Ready to go home? She looked at him. Home? If you want it to be. The ride back to the homestead was quieter than the ride in. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was the kind of quiet that came after storms, when the air cleared and you could finally see what was left standing. At the cabin, they dismounted together. The sun was dropping lower, painting everything gold and orange. Caleb stood looking at the dry creek bed, thinking about water that used to flow and might again. Will you try? Aida asked. With the rod? He fetched it from the barn, forked willow, worn smooth. She met him at the creek bed, and without speaking they both understood. He held the rod. She placed her hands over his, their fingers intertwined around the wood, calloused and scarred and honest. They closed their eyes together. Caleb felt his heartbeat, felt Aida's breathing beside him, steady and sure, felt the earth beneath his boots, the same earth that had carried his loneliness for 2 years and her trauma for 15. The rod pulled down, sharp, unmistakable. His eyes opened. You feel that? Yes. She was smiling, the first real smile he'd seen on her face. The water knows. It was waiting. They marked the spot with a stone, then dug together as the sun touched the horizon. 6 feet down, maybe 7. His shovel hit wetness, then mud, then water began seeping up, clear and cold. Running springs, returning. They both knelt at the edge of the hole, watching water pool and rise. Aida cupped her hands, brought water to her lips, drank, then offered her cupped palms to Caleb. He drank from her hands, the water tasting of minerals and earth and the end of drought. They sat there as the hole filled, water finding its level, preparing to flow again once they cleared the old channel. Aida, Caleb's voice was rough. I'm asking, will you stay as my wife, if you'll have a man who's got more years behind him than ahead? She looked at him in the fading light. I already stayed, when I came back to that courtroom. He understood. The choice had been made when she walked through those doors instead of running. Everything after was just details. Tomorrow, he said, we'll go to the town clerk, make it legal. Tonight, she corrected, we are already family. The next afternoon, they rode to the land office. The clerk was the same man who'd filed Brennan's fraudulent claims, and he looked nervous seeing them. Need to update the deed, Caleb said. The clerk pulled the document, prepared the amendment form. Name for the deed holder? Caleb and Aida Thornton. The clerk's pen hesitated. Both names. That's unusual. It's right. Caleb's voice left no room for argument. The clerk wrote it. Then he melted red wax, let it pool on the paper where the seal would go. He handed the brass stamp to Caleb. Caleb handed it to Aida instead. Your mark first. She pressed her thumb into the warm wax, twisted slightly. When she pulled away, the spiral appeared. Perfect. Her father's mark, reclaimed. Caleb pressed his thumb beside hers. His print was different, rougher, scarred from years of hard work, but it settled next to hers like they'd always belonged together. 2 thumbprints in red wax. 2 names on one deed. Equal, permanent. The clerk stared. I've never seen. You have now, Aida said quietly. They left the land office as the sun reached its peak, casting no shadows. Husband and wife, partners. 2 people who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided to build something that couldn't be stolen, with paperwork or broken with lies. Running Springs was flowing again. The land remembered how. So did they. Now, I reckon there's folks who'd say that story's too clean. That justice don't work that way in the real world. That dead chiefs don't get vindicated. That land thieves die rich in their beds instead of behind bars. And maybe they're right about the world as it usually runs. But this here's a story about what happens when one man decides $8 silver is a fair price for doing right, even when he's got nothing left but dust and loneliness. About what happens when a woman chooses to speak truth even with a rope waiting on the other end of her words. Caleb and Aida worked that homestead together for 34 years. Running Springs never ran dry again. Not through droughts that killed every other creek in the territory, not through winters that froze the ground 6 feet deep. Folks said the water knew it was being honored. They raised 3 children who carried both names, Thornton and Tahoma, taught them that justice isn't something written in law books or sealed in wax. It's something you stand up for when it costs everything you have. Judge McCready died 6 weeks after that trial. They say his last words were, "One clean signature." Doc Harlow kept the original treaty in the courthouse archives until he passed 20 years later. It's in a museum now, behind glass with a card explaining what it cost. That courthouse bell rang every day at noon from that September afternoon forward, marking time, reminding folks that sometimes truth matters more than convenience. As for Silas Brennan, well, some men build their whole lives on lies. When the foundation cracks, everything comes down. He served 3 years, came out broken, died alone in a boarding house nobody visited. Different endings for different choices. The West wasn't won with guns like the legends say. It was won by people like Aita, who found courage to speak when silence was safer, like Caleb, who chose right over easy, like Doc and the judge, who finally decided their souls mattered more than survival. By God's mercy, sometimes that's enough. Final image. 2 thumbprints pressed in red wax mounted in a simple frame on a cabin wall. Sunlight catches the spiral pattern, organic, intentional, permanent. Below, through an open window, a creek runs clear over stones, and children's laughter rides the wind like water, finding its path home.